One interesting thing about Westford is the fact that it is made up of several different villages. You may have wondered about how the various sections of Westford got their names. Ellen Harde, a longtime Westford resident and local historian, explains the origins of the village names.
The sections of town were Forge Village, Graniteville, Nabnasset, which was originally called Nabnasset, Brookside, and Parkerville. So some of them, it's pretty obvious how they got their names. Forge Village was in fact where there was an iron forge. There was a smelting. The iron ore came from Groton. At that point, Forge may have even been part of Groton because we acquired that from Groton. And it was the Prescott family who owned that, and it operated until the mid-1800s. So it truly was a forge village. Mainly it was parts for wagons, the springs and the axles and that. So I think that it is tools as well as wagon parts. So that was largely what it did. Mr. Hodgman is a little disparaging. He says it really wasn't very good quality, and it's one of the reasons that it went out of business. After the smelting company, there was a Forge Village nail company, and then that went defunct in the 1850s or 60s, and that's when the Abbotts bought that property and built the Abbott Mill that is in Forge Village at the moment, but the name Forge Village stuck. This is an old print of Graniteville, and you can see up on the hill, all of these are quarries. So they were not large quarries, they were all just individual sort of outcroppings of granite. Basically they were boulders, and different families like the Palmers owned those areas, and that's where Graniteville got its name, from all of the granite that's up there.
Fletcher granite has actually been used in many buildings and monuments throughout the United States. Some examples include Quincy Market, Harvard University, the National Gallery of Art, the Supreme Court steps, and the Treasury Building in Washington, D.C. Although Graniteville is the area of town usually associated with granite, some granite can actually be found throughout the town. One example is the house and barn boulders, which can be accessed from a trail at the end of Sawmill Road. These massive granite boulders are glacial erratics which were left here during the last ice age. These boulders are a fun spot to visit and have been climbed by Westford kids for generations.
The Nabnasset was an Indian name.
Robert Oliphant suggests 3 possible translations of Nabnasset in his book, The Westford Gazetteer. They are near the dry land, pond number 12, or Chestnut Tree Place.
But that was basically it was surrounded around the lake. And then it became a little summer village, and the small cottages were there where people came out for the summer. Brookside was also right near Nabnasset. It's where the mill was, now condominiums at the Brookside Mill in Nabnasset. And then Parker Village was named for the Parker family, who had a large farmhouse just about where the Jack Walsh Field is now. Actually, it was called the Village, and if you read in Mr. Hodgman's book, where he describes the different sections of town, he does refer to it as the Village. And that tended to be where, well, obviously it was where the church was. The church as in, when you wanted to become a town, and Westford didn't become a town until 1729. There were people here for almost 100 years, but we were part of Chelmsford. But to become a town, you had to have your own church. So the church and the town were one and the same. So that's where the church was. When they built the town hall, that's where the town hall was. So that was the municipal center. And then the villages where people lived. And there was an animosity between the people who lived on the hill, as it was called, and the people who lived on the villages, because the mill owners, although the mills were down in Forge and Graniteville, the mill owners, except for Mr. Sargent, but Mr. Abbott lived up on the hill. There were about 5 Abbott houses right around the common, but the Abbotts all lived in the center. Mr. Cameron, who was Mr. Abbott's vice president lived in the center. There was a sense of we and they. The other thing that caused that was when the mills opened, there were not enough people living in Westford to provide the work in the mills. So the Abbotts brought a lot of people to live, to come work in Westford. And they went to Russia, to Belarus, and brought in a large number of Russians to work in the mill. Polish people came, Canadians came, and quite a few Englishmen came, mainly because they were superb soccer players. And Mr. Abbott had a soccer team that was a national ranking, so he would go pick out the best soccer players to come work for him. So there was also that difference in terms of the people who lived in the villages. Many of them were immigrants. Many of them did not speak English when they first got here. So that set up not a tension, but a difference in terms of those parts of Westford. And even until 1973, 4 of those villages had their own post offices and had their own zip codes. And the time that the post office consolidated those into one, it was a crisis, because the people who had been born in Forge Village, most of whose family worked in the Abbott Mill, for them, that was where they lived. They did not live in Westford. They lived in Forge Village. And to this day, that's very important for the people who live there, who have always lived there. Graniteville also has its own personality, the Healy's especially. It's not as strong as it was in Forge, because Forge was a larger community. So those very much kept their entity. Nabnasset was a far more transient group, because it tended to be a summer community.